In the heart of the untamed wilderness, under a scorching sun, something stirred in the tall grass. A faint, trembling cry, so weak it could have been mistaken for the wind, broke the silence of the plains. But it was not the wind. It was a desperate plea for life. Alone on the edge of the grasslands, an old woman named Nyara halted mid-step, her sharp eyes scanning the swaying fields. Her breath caught in her throat. The cry came again, softer this time, fading, as if whatever made the sound was losing its grip on existence. Driven by something deeper than curiosity, Nyara stepped forward. Each movement sent dry stalks whispering against her legs, the golden grass parting beneath her cautious hands. And then she saw it, a small, fragile creature, its white fur stained with dirt and blood, its golden eyes filled with terror. A leopard cub, alone and abandoned, trembling between life and death. For a moment, everything was still. The wind held its breath. The sun bore witness. And as Nyara slowly extended her hand, something shifted. A moment of fate, a bond that would defy nature itself. But was it salvation or the beginning of a legend? What happens next will shock you. Hit like. If you're already hooked, share this story to keep the legend alive, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of survival, love, and sacrifice. The sun bled across the horizon, its dying light staining the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The vast plains stretched endlessly, an ocean of dry grass rippling beneath the whisper of the evening wind. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth, carrying the distant cries of birds circling like silent omens above the land. Everything stood still, watching, waiting, as if the very world held its breath. Nyara moved through the brittle grass with the careful steps of one who had long learned to listen to the land. Her body, worn by time and toil, bore the weight of years, yet there was strength in her frame, a quiet endurance that had outlasted both storms and droughts. She had chosen this solitude, embraced it like an old friend, letting the wilderness be her only companion. The fire of youth had long faded from her face, leaving behind deep lines carved by sorrow and survival. Yet her dark eyes still burned with something fierce, an ember that refused to die. She bent down, fingers brushing against the cracked earth as she gathered a few fallen branches. The silence was comforting, familiar. But then, a sound, faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried by the wind, a tremor in the stillness. Nyara stiffened, every sense sharpening. She straightened, breath caught in her chest, and listened. The sound came again, a fragile, broken whimper, almost swallowed by the vastness around her. It was not the call of a bird, nor the rustling of grass. It was something else, something alive. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she followed the sound, pushing through the towering reeds. The wind stirred uneasily, as if whispering a warning. Then suddenly she saw it, a small figure curled against the base of a dying tree, its frail body trembling, half hidden in the shadows. A creature, barely clinging to life. Its fur was white, almost unnaturally so, streaked with dust and matted with sweat. Its ears twitched at her approach, but it did not flee. Large, terrified eyes met hers, pleading, lost. It was young, too young to be alone. A sharp pang lanced through Naya's chest, raw and unexpected. She had not felt this kind of pull in years. The instinct to protect, to comfort. Yet here it was, clawing at the walls she had built around her heart. Slowly she lowered herself to the ground, extending a hand. The creature flinched but did not move away. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The wind howled softly through the trees, the sky darkened, and the world held its breath once more. This was no ordinary meeting. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. Nyara carried the frail cub in her arms as she made her way back to her small hut at the edge of the grasslands. The little creature barely stirred, its breaths shallow and uneven. Its fur, white as the morning mist, was matted with dirt and speckled with dried blood. Though she had seen many animals in her long life, she had never encountered a white leopard cub before. The sight filled her with both awe and concern. She entered her modest home, a simple structure made of dried grass, clay, and wooden beams. The inside was dimly lit by a small fire, casting flickering shadows on the walls. In one corner lay a worn-out mat where Nyara slept. In another, a few earthen pots and tools she used for daily survival. This was not a place of luxury, but it was safe, and now it would be a sanctuary for the abandoned cub. Nyara carefully placed the tiny creature on a blanket near the fire and began tending to its wounds. She boiled water and used strips of clean cloth to wipe away the grime. The cub flinched at first, a soft whimper escaping its throat, but soon it relaxed under her gentle touch. As she worked, she spoke to it in a soothing voice, whispering words of comfort as if the animal could understand her. "You must be strong, little one," she murmured. "The world is cruel to those who are weak. But I will help you. We will help each other." She decided to call it Kiro, a name that, in the old tongue, meant light in the storm. She did not know why she chose this name, only that it felt right. Perhaps deep in her heart, she hoped that Kira would bring a spark of light into her lonely existence. The first few days were difficult. Kira refused to eat at first, too frightened and weak. Nyara mashed up bits of cooked meat and tried to feed him by hand. At times he resisted, turning his face away, but she was patient. Slowly he began to trust her. He licked the meat from her fingers, his tiny body shivering as he swallowed. Each meal was a victory, a small step toward survival. At night, Cairo curled up near the fire, his body twitching in restless sleep. Nyara watched over him, her heart aching with an emotion she had not felt in years. She had once been a mother, long ago, before fate had stripped everything from her. Now, in this tiny creature, she found a new purpose. As the weeks passed, Kiro grew stronger. His legs became sturdier, his movements more confident. At first, he only wandered around the hut, but soon he began following Nyara whenever she stepped outside. He would stumble through the tall grass, his paws clumsy but determined. One morning, as Nyara went to fetch water from the river, Kiro trotted beside her. He was still small, but his spirit was fierce. When a bird fluttered nearby, he crouched, his tail swishing as he prepared to pounce. He leaped, only to land face first into the dirt. Nyara chuckled, the sound surprising even herself. It had been so long since she had laughed. "You have much to learn, little hunter," she said, picking him up and brushing the dust from his fur. And so, she began teaching him. Nyara was no stranger to survival. She had lived alone for many years, depending on her knowledge of the land. Now she passed that wisdom to Kiro. She taught him how to move silently through the grass, how to listen to the wind, how to sense danger before it arrived. At first he was impatient, pouncing too soon or missing the signs she tried to show him. But with time he learned. She watched with pride as he practiced stalking small creatures, his movements growing sharper, his instincts keener. Yet for all his strength, Cairo remained gentle with her. He would nuzzle her hand, his icy blue eyes filled with warmth. Though he was a creature of the wild, he had chosen to stay by her side. The villagers, however, saw things differently. It began as murmurs. Nyara would go to the marketplace for supplies and feel the weight of wary gazes upon her. She heard the hushed voices, the fearful whispers about the white beast she had taken in. "A demon," someone muttered. "A cursed creature." "She should have let it die," another said. "That thing will bring misfortune." Nyara ignored them. She had spent most of her life as an outcast, and she had no desire to explain herself to those who would never understand. But the unease in the village grew. The people spoke of old legends, of spirits that took the form of white animals, omens of disaster. And when hunters returned with stories of a great white leopard prowling the outskirts of the village, fear turned into something darker. One evening, as Nyara gathered herbs near the river, she saw a group of men watching her from afar. They held spears, their expressions grim. She knew then that trouble was coming. That night she sat by the fire, running her fingers through Kiro's thick fur. He was no longer the fragile cub she had found in the grasslands. He had grown strong, his muscles lean and powerful beneath his shimmering coat. But to the villagers, he would always be a monster. Kiro lifted his head, ears twitching as if sensing her unease. He nudged her arm, his eyes searching hers. Nyara sighed, resting her forehead against his. "They fear what they do not understand," she whispered. "But you are not a monster. You are my family." She knew, however, that words would not stop what was coming. The following days were tense. The hunter's presence near her home became more frequent. She saw them watching from a distance, their hands gripping their weapons. She heard them speak of plans, of traps and ambushes. They believed Kiro was a threat, and they would not rest until he was gone. Nyara considered running, fleeing into the wilderness where no one could find them. But she was old and the land beyond was harsh. Could she truly protect Kiro out there? And even if they left, would the hunters not simply track them down? She stayed awake long into the night, listening to Kiro's steady breathing. The bond they had built was unbreakable, but she feared it would soon be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. And deep in the village, the hunters sharpened their spears, preparing for the night when they would come for the white beast. As the days passed, whispers began to circulate through the village. It started with hushed voices at the marketplace, cautious glances toward the distant hills where Nyara's small hut stood. Rumors had a way of twisting reality, turning uncertainty into fear, and fear into hatred. The tale of a white beast lurking near the village spread like wildfire, feeding into the superstitions that had taken root in the villagers' minds for generations. "It is unnatural," one man muttered to his neighbor as they sharpened their hunting spears. "A creature like that, it's an omen, a curse, a demon," another agreed. "I heard it moves like a shadow, its eyes glowing like fire in the night. If we let it grow, it will turn on us." Nyara was unaware of the full extent of these whispers at first. She had long learned to live apart from the villagers, preferring the quiet companionship of nature over the fickle nature of people. But she could sense the shift, how travelers who once greeted her with nods now averted their eyes, how the hunters who passed through the plains carried their weapons more tightly when they saw her walking with Kiro. One evening, as she returned from gathering firewood, she noticed something that made her heart pound with unease. Near the boundary of her land, she found deep footprints, human footprints. They were fresh, the edges still crisp against the dry earth. Someone had been watching. Kiro, now nearly fully grown, let out a low growl beside her. His muscles tensed. His once timid frame had grown into that of a majestic predator, his white coat gleaming under the dying light of the sun. But to Nyara, he was still the same cub that had once fit in the crook of her arm, the same creature that had placed its tiny paw into her palm, sealing their unspoken bond. "We should be careful, Kiro," she murmured, running her fingers through his thick fur. "There are some who do not understand." That night, as the wind howled through the plains, Nyara sat by the fire staring into the flames. Memories flooded her mind. The first days with Kiro, his hesitant steps into her home, the way he had learned to hunt under her guidance. He was no monster. He was a survivor, just like her. But survival was a fragile thing in a world where fear dictated actions. The first real warning came when a stone crashed through the thin wooden window of her hut. It landed just inches from the fire, rolling to a stop near her feet. Nyara's heart clenched as she picked it up, turning it over in her aged hands. The villagers had made their decision. Fear had turned to aggression. The following days were tense. She could feel the presence of unseen eyes watching her from the edges of the plains. She caught glimpses of shadows moving between the trees, heard the rustle of bushes disturbed by hurried movements. They were testing the waters, waiting for the right moment. Then came the night when the waiting ended. The distant sound of voices echoed through the darkness, growing louder as they approached. The flickering glow of torches cut through the night, casting long, wavering shadows across the land. Nyara stepped outside, her heart pounding against her ribs. A group of men stood at the edge of her property, their faces set with grim determination. Some held torches, others clutched spears and bows. "Kiro, stay inside," she whispered, but she knew he wouldn't. He emerged from the shadows, his presence an undeniable force. He did not growl, did not bare his fangs. He only stood beside her, his golden eyes locked onto the men before them. Nyara, the leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man named Harun, stepped forward. "You know why we're here?" "I know," she answered, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. "But you do not understand what you seek to destroy." Harun's grip on his spear tightened. "That thing is not natural. It's too large, too different. It's a danger to all of us." "He is no danger unless you make him one," Nyara countered, stepping forward. He has never harmed a soul. He has only ever known kindness. The men shifted uneasily, but fear had already poisoned their thoughts. We cannot take that chance. One of the hunters, younger and braver than the rest, raised his spear. The motion was swift, thoughtless, but in that moment, everything slowed. Nyara saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the brief second where he could have chosen another path. But the spear left his hand, slicing through the air, aimed straight for Cairo. Before she could react, before she could throw herself between them, Cairo moved. The powerful feline lunged, not toward the men, but toward her. The impact sent her crashing to the ground, and a searing pain tore through the night as the spear embedded itself into Cairo's side. A cry of rage and pain erupted from his throat, a sound that sent chills through the gathered crowd. Blood, dark against his pale fur, spread in slow blooming patterns. He staggered, but his eyes never left Nyara's face. In them, she saw the same trust, the same unbreakable bond they had shared since the moment he had first placed his paw in her hand. The crowd fell silent. Even Harun, who had led this charge, seemed uncertain now. What they had witnessed was not the act of a beast, it was the sacrifice of a friend. Nyara crawled toward Kiro, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound, as if sheer willpower alone could mend what had been broken. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Please, my Kiro." For a moment it seemed as though he might collapse. His breaths were labored, his legs shaking under his weight. But then something shifted in his gaze. He took a step back, his head lifting, his body poised as if ready to run. "No," Nyara pleaded, but she understood. If he stayed, they would not stop. They would come again, and again, until there was nothing left of him but a legend whispered on the wind. With one final look, Kiro turned and ran, his powerful form disappearing into the dark embrace of the wilderness. The hunters did not chase him. None dared to. They stood in silence, watching the ghost of the white beast vanish into the night. Nyara remained kneeling in the dirt, her hands stained with his blood, her heart torn between relief and sorrow. He was free, but at what cost? The night was suffocating, its darkness pressing heavily upon the village like a shroud of impending doom. Shadows flickered against the thatched walls of Nyara's hut as the villagers gathered, their torches casting erratic glows on tense, fearful faces. The weight of anticipation settled thick in the air, each person gripping their weapons with a mixture of conviction and apprehension. Inside, Nyara knelt beside Kiro, her wrinkled hands smoothing over the thick fur of the white leopard, now fully grown and magnificent. He had sensed the unrest long before the shouts began, his muscles coiled under her touch, not out of aggression, but the readiness of a creature that knew survival was a constant battle. His golden eyes locked onto hers, and in them, she saw the unspoken understanding between them. They were each other's only family, and family protected one another. The first blow came not from a weapon, but from words, harsh, unyielding words laced with fear. "Nyara, step aside! That beast is a curse upon us all." It was Jaro, the village elder, his voice trembling with the authority of someone desperately trying to maintain control. His weathered face, usually a mask of wisdom, was twisted with fear. Behind him, younger men, emboldened by numbers, clutched their spears, ready but hesitant. Nyara rose slowly, her frail frame casting an elongated shadow under the wavering light. "Kiro is no beast," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging outside. "He has harmed no one." "He is unnatural, an omen of death," someone shouted from the crowd. A murmur of agreement rippled through them, fanned by years of whispered superstition and fear of the unknown. Kiro let out a low, guttural growl, not of rage but of warning. The villagers tensed, gripping their weapons tighter. One wrong move, one spark of panic, and blood would spill. Nyara stepped in front of him, arms spread wide. "If Kiro wanted harm, you would not be standing here," she declared. "He has lived among us, in the shadows of your fear, without ever striking first." But fear was an unforgiving master. One of the younger hunters, too frightened to think, lifted his spear and hurled it forward. The world slowed. Nyara turned just as Kiro sprang. The blade meant for her struck him instead, burying deep into his shoulder. A snarl of pain tore from his throat, and the sound sent ice through the crowd. Blood, dark against his pale fur, began to seep, staining the earth beneath him. A hush fell upon them all. Kiro staggered but did not collapse. His eyes met Nyara's, filled not with rage but something deeper, something that made her chest tighten with an unbearable ache. He understood. He had always understood. He would not fight them. He would not become the monster they feared. With one final glance at Nyara, Kiro turned and ran, his powerful form vanishing into the night, the darkness swallowing him whole. The villagers watched, stunned, as the white shadow disappeared beyond the hills. He left, someone whispered. Nyara sank to her knees, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had lost everything before, but this pain was different. This was the pain of knowing he had chosen exile to spare her. She closed her eyes and whispered into the empty night, "Be free, Kiro." The days following Kiro's departure passed like an aching blur. Nyara remained in her hut, the silence pressing in around her like a living thing. The absence of soft footfalls outside, of golden eyes watching over her, of the deep rhythmic purring that had once soothed her to sleep. Each was a wound that time would not heal. The village carried on as if nothing had happened, but even the air felt different. The usual morning bustle of farmers tending their fields was subdued, the chatter at the market quieter than before. The night, once filled with the distant calls of creatures that had kept the balance, now felt empty. Nyara no longer ventured into the village, nor did she linger at the riverbank where she and Kiro had once walked together. She spent her days sitting outside her hut, eyes trained on the horizon, searching for a glimpse of white against the endless plains. The wind carried whispers, the rustling of tall grass sounding almost like footsteps, but they were always false hopes. Kiro was gone, yet she knew somehow that he still watched. The hunters were the first to notice the shift. At first, they took pride in Kiro's absence, believing they had rid the land of a dangerous predator. But soon they began to realize what they had truly done. Without Kiro's silent vigilance, the balance had crumbled. The wolves, sensing the absence of the white guardian, grew bold. They crept closer to the village, attacking livestock in the dead of night. Farmers woke to find their goats and chickens missing, nothing left but bloody tracks leading into the wilderness. The villagers who had once cursed Kiro's existence now spoke of him in hushed voices, their fear turning to guilt. One evening, Yarrow, the village elder, made his way toward Nyara's hut. The journey was slow, his aged limbs protesting each step, but he carried something heavier than exhaustion, regret. He found her seated by the fire, her frail hands wrapped around a wooden bowl of stew that had long since gone cold. She did not look up as he approached. "May I sit?" he asked hesitantly. Nyara said nothing for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Jarro lowered himself onto the ground beside her. The flames between them crackled softly, casting long, flickering shadows. He stared into the fire, gathering his thoughts. Finally, he exhaled. "We were wrong." Nyara let the words settle in the night air before she finally turned her head to look at him. Her gaze was unreadable, old eyes filled with something deeper than sorrow. Disappointment. "You took him from me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And now you understand what you've lost." Jarro swallowed, shame pressing down on him like an unbearable weight. "The hunters. They say the land is restless now, that something is missing." Nyara let out a bitter chuckle, shaking her head. "Missing," she repeated, the word tasting of irony on her tongue. Jarro hesitated, then said, "If we could take it back." "You can't." The finality in her voice silenced him. After a moment, he nodded. He had come seeking absolution, but there would be none. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was neither pity nor apology, just understanding. "Is he still out there?" he asked at last. Nyara turned her gaze to the vast open plains stretching beyond the village. The wind stirred the tall grass, carrying the scent of distant rain. "Yes," she said softly, "but not for you." Months passed. The seasons shifted, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. The villagers adjusted as they always had, but something lingered, a weight they could not name. Then, on a bitter winter night, it happened. A child had wandered too far beyond the village, chasing the flickering light of fireflies. His mother's warnings had gone unheard, her voice lost to the wind as the boy ventured into the dark. By the time she noticed he was gone, it was too late. A scream shattered the night. The villagers rushed toward the sound, torches lighting up the dense underbrush. The hunters, armed and wary, pushed forward, following the desperate cries. And then, a deep, guttural snarl. The wolves had come. They saw the child first, small, trembling, his hands clutching the earth in terror. Then the shadows moved. Not the wolves, something else. A blur of white, a streak of movement so fast that it was over before the hunters could even process it. The wolves yelped, snapping at the air before retreating into the darkness, tails between their legs. When the torches illuminated the scene, the child was still there, untouched, unharmed. The ground around him bore fresh claw marks, but not from wolves. A single massive paw print stood out against the frost-covered dirt, leading away into the trees. The hunters stood frozen. No one spoke, but they all knew. He had returned. The news reached Nyara at dawn. She did not weep. She did not smile. Instead, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked. The villagers watched in silence as she made her way to the edge of the plains, to the place where the hills met the wilderness beyond. She stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at her clothes, her old hands gripping the fabric tightly. Then from the shadows of the trees, he emerged. Kiro. His body was leaner now, his muscles sharpened by the struggles of the wild. His fur bore the marks of battles fought in solitude. But his eyes, his golden, unyielding eyes, remained unchanged. He did not come closer. He knew he could not. Nyara's breath caught in her throat, but she did not call out. She simply watched him, taking in every detail, memorizing every line, as if this moment would have to last her a lifetime. "You have found your place," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "And I have found mine." For the first time in months, she smiled. Kiro let out a deep rumbling sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, a farewell, a promise. Then with one final look, he turned and disappeared into the wild. The villagers who had followed her remained silent, watching as Nyara lowered her head in prayer. From that day on, the legend of Kiro, the White Guardian, spread beyond the village. Travelers spoke of a pale shadow that roamed the outskirts of the plains, neither beast nor spirit. Some said he was a protector, others whispered he was waiting. And though Nyara grew older, though her days of wandering faded, she was never truly alone. For every night, when the wind howled through the trees, when the stars burned bright over the vast grasslands, she would hear it, a deep, distant roar, a promise carried by the wind. He was still there. The story of Nyara and Cairo is one of love, sacrifice, and the consequences of fear. Despite their deep bond, the world rejected what it did not understand. Cairo, though strong enough to fight, chose not to. His greatest power lay in restraint, in walking away rather than becoming the monster they feared. His departure was painful, but it was the only way to protect the one he loved. Yet Cairo was never truly gone. Even in exile, he remained a silent guardian, watching over the village from afar. Over time, the people who had once hunted him realized their mistake, understanding too late that their fear had blinded them. He had never been their enemy. He had been their protector. His legend grew, whispered in the wind, and carried in the hearts of those who had once feared him. This tale reminds us that fear can cloud judgment, but wisdom and love endure. Strength is not always in battle, but in knowing when to walk away. Even when separated, true bonds remain unbroken. And sometimes the greatest heroes are those who choose not to fight, but to live on, becoming something greater than themselves. Kiro was more than a beast. He became a legend, a guardian, a presence that would never fade. He was still there,